Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for turning up on this really hot day. My name is Javed, and I'm currently the head of research and publications at CSPS, and I'm also teaching at Ambedkar University, Delhi. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Laurence Gautier as the speaker today, and we're discussing her recently published book, Hot Out of the Oven, Between Nation and Community, Muslim Universities and Indian Politics After Partition. And we're also honored to have my mentor, Dr. Amir Ali, who will be discussing the work, the monograph, and we also have Dr. Irfanullah Farooqi, who will also give his comments on the work. And I once again welcome all of you. From here on, I hand over the proceedings to Dr. Amir Ali.
So I am again delighted to be here. This place is now beginning to be familiar for me. I don't seem to know my way around here. But let me just begin with a few words of preliminary introduction. So I was really happy to read your book. It was a great read. I would have liked to spend a little more time. This is the end of the semester, so we're going bonkers with grading these days. But even then, I managed to read quite a lot of it. I'm going to make a few prefatory, preliminary remarks, which will hopefully set the ball rolling. This is a significant work. It's significant because it is a great work of documentation in terms of the sheer amount of work that's gone into this. But more than that, it's the way that Laurence has tried to tell the political history through two universities. And I think it's a pretty innovative way of doing history, a political history. I think perhaps I'm suggesting an alternative title for you, A Tale of Two Universities. That's perhaps one way in which it could have been titled. Academic publishers don't like such adventurous titles. But the interesting thing is the way that these two universities intersect, intertwine, and then kind of move apart. That's the way that I read it for you. So I'm sure most of you here will know that Jamia was actually set up in Aligarh. It's not common knowledge. And then, of course, it was moved to Delhi 5 years after being set up, product of the Khilafat non-cooperation movement. The interesting thing that emerges here is that there's a certain kind of a strange entwining and separating that goes on in terms of this book. Now, the separation happens in terms of both these universities representing two completely opposite political stances. There is the separatism of Aligarh, and there is the composite nationalism of Jamia. Now, this is the contention and the tension between these two universities. And despite that, there's always this kind of a coming together and kind of moving apart, which is the way that I read the book. The interesting thing that you point out a number of times in this book is the way that in the immediate aftermath of independence, the inevitable establishment actually approached AMU much more assiduously and almost kind of overlooked Jamia, which was strange because Jamia was the product of the national movement itself. And of course, there are reasons which you're going to. The other thing that struck me is, again, more recent, which is the way that these universities have become bastions of a certain Islamic assertion. And this has to do with, especially the 70s and 80s, and the rise of right-wing organizations like the Student Islamic movement in India. And again, it gives a particular kind of characteristic, a particular cast to the politics of these two universities. But the one thing that I would want to mention, because let me also add that reading this book was extremely resonant for me. I was a student at AMU in the early to mid-90s. And then I was a faculty member at Jamia at the beginning of my career, which is a long time ago now. Before I joined JMU, 2004, 2007, I got there for 3.5 years. Mushir had just become the vice chancellor. So I read this book as a kind of as a personal journey as well. And it was very interesting to read the book that way. But the one point that you do make which struck me, which is the way that Jamia has almost overtaken Aligarh in terms of the kind of position that it occupies in the national imagination of being the Muslim university. Now, there's a long story, and Laurence, you point this out, and I completely agree with you on this one, that there's a certain kind of a provincialization that Aligarh underwent, whereby it became more mired into being a regional UP university, drawing its students predominantly from UP to some extent. But Jamia then really kind of charged ahead, and it's interesting to see that. I'm fortunate to have been in Jamia around that time when it was really kind of charging ahead in terms of this. But that was the moving apart that I wanted to stress. But having made those points, over to you, Laurence.
Thank you very much, and I would like to thank, of course, Javed for inviting me today. I must say I'm very excited. This is the first book talk that I give. So I'm extremely happy to be giving this talk here. I've already come here as a discussant twice, and I know that this is a fantastic platform for discussion. It's going to be a fairly long discussion, presentation, so let me start straight away. First of all, Amir, thank you so much for pointing out that this is very much a political history. It's not an institutional history. It's not so much about educational history either, though of course I do talk about educational policies, but it's primarily a political history of two Muslim universities, so AMU and Jamia Millia, in the post-independence context, so going from 1947 to the 1990s, even though I also talk a bit about the late colonial period. My objective was really to look at these educational institutions as political sites that have played a central part in the debates on Muslims' location in the nation-state after India's independence. And in line with Jürgen Habermas, the idea was really to highlight the critical role that academic institutions, especially universities, have to play in the self-understanding that a society has of itself. There is already a well-established tradition in Indian historiography that shows the political role of educational institutions during the colonial period, as education emerged as a contested terrain. And here maybe we can move to the next slide. As education moved as a contested terrain between the colonizers and the colonized, as well as within the Indian population. Educational institutions embodied different responses to the establishment of colonial rule, from accommodation to efforts to preserve autonomy or even open opposition to colonial rule. In the process, educational institutions have contributed to shaping notions of the nation and of community, not just for Muslims, but also for other communities too. And here I have in mind more particularly the well-known studies of David Lelyveld and Barbara Metcalfe that show how some prominent Muslim educational institutions contributed during the colonial period to the emergence of the idea of Indian Muslims being a pan-Indian community, despite the ongoing differences that remained in practice among among Indian Muslims. Now, prime among these institutions was, of course, the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, the ancestor of AMU, which is one of the two institutions at the heart of this book. So I'm not going to spend too much time here on the history of AMU, but just because I assume that many of you are familiar with it, but just a few reminders. So Sir Syed established the AMU College in 1875 to provide modern education to Muslim students, primarily from elite background, so that they may retain a privileged access to circles of power after the fall of the Mughal Empire and the establishment of colonial rule. So Sir Syed envisioned the AMU College as a training ground for Muslim elites, so that they may act as the leaders of them all, of the community. For him, the institution was meant to serve and speak for the entire Muslim population, which he considered to be a single call. The establishment of the All India Muslim Educational Conference in Aligarh itself, a few years later, was supposed to bolster in the AMU College's role as an All India Muslim Center. And of course, we all know that college authorities were also closely associated with the foundation of the Muslim League, which claimed to speak for all Indian Muslims. From the beginning, however, the college's claim to act and speak for the entire Muslim Ummah was much disputed. Within the college itself, there was no consensus regarding the political orientation of the institution. So you just said that there was, of course, a strong association with the Muslim League, but we also know that, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, pro-Congress members were quite influential, and so too were left-wing members, Marxist members of the college, of the university. The AMU became officially university in 1920. Now, as anti-colonial feelings rose, sections of the college increasingly challenged the loyalist stance of college authorities, and the foundation of Jamia Millia is very much a testimony of these divisions. So in that sense, you're absolutely right. The book shows how these trajectories are both closely intertwined and distinct. Former AMU members, students especially, played a key role in the establishment of what was called the National Islamic University, so the Jamia Millia Islamia, in 1920, in the wake of the Khilafat movement and of Gandhi's non-cooperation movement. Unlike AMU, Jamia remained fully independent from colonial state authorities. They also distanced themselves from the Muslim League and remained firmly committed to the ideal of a united India, including at the time of partition. Now, my book builds on these well-known studies, which are mostly focused on the colonial period, to look at these institutions in the post-colonial period. Now, by shifting attention to this post-colonial period, new questions arise. What relations did these institutions develop with the new state authorities in independent India? How did partition affect their political stance? And also, what role did they endorse in the nation-building project? What we have to remember is that for new state authorities in independent India, educational institutions, especially universities, had a critical role to play in nation building. First, to develop economic and industrial infrastructure to ensure that India would be a viable state, but also to foster what the University Education Commission named the spiritual unity of the country, which was far from being a given in the immediate aftermath of partition. Now, within this framework, the question then is, what role did state authorities envision for Muslim universities? Now, unlike madrasas and private Muslim schools, after independence, both AMU and Jamia gradually became public institutions controlled by the state. AMU became a central university as early as 1951. It was one of the first 3 central universities in the country. So under the control of the central government, and Jamia was deemed a university in 1962 before it became a central university much later, in 1988. As such, these universities found themselves at a critical juncture between central state authorities and India's Muslim population. As state-sponsored universities, they were to train citizens to contribute to national integration and development. And as Muslim institutions, they were expected to promote primarily the interests of Indian Muslims and to transmit a cultural legacy specifically associated with this population. Hence my interest in these 2 specific institutions. Now, what are the key arguments of the book? First, as Amir has already highlighted, I insist upon the fact that these institutions did not serve just as platforms to think of the community, but also as platforms to imagine the nation. And here it's important because it shows how minority-led institutions can play an important role in producing counter-narratives to majoritarian conception of the nation. They can serve as platforms to imagine the nation from a non-majoritarian perspective. Second, I argue that central state authorities regarded these institutions, especially AMU, as intermediaries with the Muslim population. In their eyes, these institutions served as platforms to speak to the Muslim population, especially in the post-partition context, where Nehru sought to secure Muslim sense of belonging to the nation. And by looking at the state's attitude towards its institutions, basically, I try to highlight the ambivalences of the state's secular nationalism. Because on the one side, after partition, state authorities firmly opposed separate political representation for religious minorities, so they put an end to separate electorates. At the same time, they continued in practice to address Indian Muslims as a separate population through these Muslim institutions. So that's my second argument. My third argument is to say that Muslim universities constituted major centers for different strands of Muslim politics in post-independence India. This role was all the more important in the absence of a strong Muslim political party for Muslims in North India. What we have to remember is that education after partition was not only critical to nation building, it was also critical to community building. Education, as you may remember, was one of the few fields in which the Constitution granted special rights to religious minorities, and so for many Muslim spokespersons or leaders, education constituted as a privileged sphere to elaborate their project for the community. So in this context, Muslim universities became both objects and arenas of debate involving a wide range of actors, not only students, teachers, and university authorities, but also community organizations and state actors. And so by closely looking at the debates both within and around these institutions, the objective of this book is really to explore how these universities became crucibles for competing conceptions of Muslims' location in the Indian nation state. Now, just a few words about the sources. I use a very wide range of sources in Urdu and in English, both official and non-official. So, for example, if you look at the perspective of the state actors, I looked at the archives of the Ministry of Education or the Home Ministry, correspondence and speeches, or even autobiographical accounts of key state leaders. In the university archives, I looked at administrative reports, but also students' magazine and pamphlets. I also carried out interviews, and finally, I also looked at newspapers and magazines, some belonging to the general press, others focused on Muslim issues like Muslim India or Radiance, which you may be familiar with. Now, this is a rather long introduction, so let me go ahead with my first point. So, first, I want to argue that both AMU and Jamia served as laboratories for a composite nation around the time of partition. The first two chapters look at how these institutions try to promote a conception of India as a composite nation, as opposed to India being primarily a Hindu nation. These efforts to promote national integration did not merely result from state-led policies. University members envisioned themselves as partners rather than just followers of nation-building efforts carried out by the state. So here I'm going to talk mostly of the first chapter. The first chapter shows how Jamia members sought through its pedagogical and social experiments to give meaning to India's future independence, not just for Muslims, but for all Indians. After the end of the non-cooperation movement, Jamia authorities, who were led by Zakir Hussain, the future president of India, transformed Jamia into an experimental school which was primarily focused on basic and adult education. They drew inspiration from progressive educationists abroad, as well as from Gandhi, to promote basic education as an alternative to the colonial model of education. So among the key features of this model, you had the importance of manual work and creative activities, of which you get a sense here in this, on the cover of this magazine, so Jamia Katarika. They also chose simple Urdu over English as the main medium of instruction. Now, these choices were important. They reflected at least two objectives. First, the need to address non-elites, not just the elites. They saw education as a tool of social reform, and this also explains why they made the promotion of adult education one of their main objectives. Second, they sought to resist the growing polarization along communal lines, for example, by making both the teaching of Hindi and Urdu compulsory, as they considered the two languages to be, I quote them, the two literary forms of the tongue spoken by the people in this region. Much like Gandhi, who was very closely associated with the institution, Jamia authorities envisioned basic education as a foundation for a new national system of education. In 1937, Gandhi appointed Zakir Hussain at the head of the Varda Committee in charge of drafting a new scheme of education for the future independent nation. Zakir Hussain did not merely replicate Gandhi's ideas on education. In fact, he could be quite critical of them. For example, during the committee discussions, he openly criticized the idea that schools should rely on children's work for funding, which was one of Gandhi's ideas. At the head of the committee, he pushed for reformulation of these ideas, stressing the connection between intellectual and practical work to avoid turning schools into little factories of spinning and weaving. So in this way, Jamia members played a critical part in shaping what came to be known as the Gandhian model of education. Here you can see how these actors also participated in that. Jamia's strong patriotic stance was deeply imbued with Islamic values, and I think that's a very important point. Contrary to the idea that more religion leads to more communalism, Zakir Hussain defended the idea that it was the false interpretation of Islamic principles, not Islam itself, that led to the rise of communalism. In times of growing tensions between the Congress and the Muslim League in 1937, he contrasted the new Muslim schools like Jamia, who according to him were based on Islamic ideals, with what he called the old system of Muslim education, identified, I quote him, with one class of Muslims looking to preserve their self-interests. And this was a not-so-hidden reference to AMU, accused of pursuing the interests of Muslim elites in the garb of religion. Zakir Hussain and his colleagues made the notion of service a central part of Jamia's ethos. In their eyes, service to society constituted both a religious and a patriotic duty. As Muslims, Zakir Hussain argued, we are committed to the attainment and maintenance of freedom, to the removal of slavery, ignorance, and poverty. So hereby claiming simultaneously a strong attachment to Islamic values and to the national cause, Jamia teachers opposed the instrumental use of religion, but they also challenged Hindu majoritarian discourses which projected Islam as a religion that was alien to Indian culture and to Indian interests. Jamia's faculty remained firmly committed to the one nation policy, including at the time of partition, as I said, even though partition rights directly affected the institution. At the time of partition and in its immediate aftermath, they presented Hindu-Muslim reconciliation as the cornerstone of the nation's reconstruction. For example, during the partition riots, they opened a school in North Delhi for both refugee and local Muslim residents. At Jamia, they hosted Hindu and Sikh refugee children on campus, and they also introduced classes in Hindu ethics alongside Islamic studies. In class, they stressed the multi-religious legacy of India's culture. For example, if we go to the next slide, we see this is a timeline that was hung in Jamia's Delhi Museum, where you can see how they have clearly put together on the same timeline monuments that are associated with some of India's main religions. They also published booklets for neo-literate adults on Islam, as well as on the Vedas, the Guru Granth Sahib, the Bible, and the Upanishads. Now, this discourse on India's composite culture was very much in line with the discourse that Nehru and his education minister Maulana Azad were trying to promote at the time. Azad wanted to harness education and culture to promote national integration. But again, Jamia did not merely replicate this discourse. In fact, they could be the ones taking the initiatives. For example, I spoke of these booklets that Jamia published. Well, Azad's ministry took notice of these publications, praised them as very popular and useful for the village folk. They were addressed to adults who were learning to read. And the ministry then chose to distribute these pamphlets that Jamia had drafted in the first place. So here we can see how Jamia's efforts to promote emotional integration did not just stem from the state's initiatives, they also stemmed from their own experiences and efforts as Muslims and as educationists to overcome the trauma of partition and resist marginalization. And here the book makes a wider call to revise our understanding of emotional integration as a state-led project, to show that it did not emerge from a single source, but from an ongoing dialogue between state and non-state actors. At the time, Jamia was not yet a state institution. Now, as you mentioned it briefly in the introduction, what is surprising is that despite the very close political and ideological proximity between Jamia and Congress, Nehru's government paid actually very limited attention and gave limited support to Jamia in the 1950s. This is all the more paradoxical if we consider that, by contrast, they paid much attention to AMU. And I will explain why, but I want to argue that this treatment reflected the ambivalences of the state's secularist nationalism. So let me move on to the second point, which is universities as intermediaries. In chapter 2, I focus on AMU in the immediate aftermath of partition, which was a time of deep transformation for the institution. As you may know, in the last years of colonial rule, the Muslim League had gained increasing influence on campus at the expense of left and pro-Congress university members. Many students and teachers took an active part in their campaign for Pakistan. And so when partition came, it provoked a major crisis in the university. First, the university lost half of its students. It also lost the support of its private patrons, like princely rulers. And of course, it was widely seen as a hotbed of Muslim separatism. What is interesting for us is that in this very tense context, Nehru and Maulana Azad tried to send a reassuring message. When Nehru visited the campus in 1948, so just 1 year after independence, he told students, "Do not think that you're outsiders here, for you are as much flesh and blood in India as anyone else." This was a message for university members, but also more largely for Indian Muslims. Nehru's government may have paid little attention to Jamia, which they considered to be primarily a Gandhian institution. But they clearly identified AMU as a Muslim institution and as a center of Muslim politics. And it is precisely for this reason that they turned towards this institution. They saw AMU as a potent intermediary through which they could address Indian Muslims and rally them to the nation-building project. Zakir Hussain, the former vice-chancellor of Jamia, who became AMU's vice-chancellor in 1948 with the support of Nehru and Azad, shared a similar view. In 1915, he wrote a letter to President of India, Rajendra Prasad, in which he wrote, I quote, "To me, the work at Aligarh signified no less than the handling at one of the most significant centers of the chief problem with which Indian statesmanship is faced, the problem of an integrated nationhood in a secular democratic state. The despondent Muslim masses are scattered all over the country. We can dissipate the efforts to revive hope and faith in them. But if we do something significant at Aligarh, it can electrify them." So you can see that together, Nehru, Azad, and Zakir Hussain aimed to transform AMU, which was widely considered to be the arsenal of Muslim India, to use an expression of Jinnah, into a symbol and an instrument of national integration. But for this to happen, university members first had to sift their legacy, to use Azad's words, in order to detach themselves from the Martin League legacy and prove undivided loyalty to the Indian nation state at a time when, people were still figuring out what the border actually meant. Remember that at the time, of course, nowadays the border between India and Pakistan is one of the hardest borders in the world, but at the time there were still many people crossing that border. So to prove undivided loyalty to the Indian state was not evident, including for the staunchest supporters of Congress. Now, the 1951 Act, which granted AMU Central University status, was of course a major step in this reorientation. It reinforced state control over the institution. It also opened up the court, which is the university's main administrative body, to non-Muslims and made religious instruction non-compulsory. Now, to reform the institution, Zakir Hussain could rely on the support of large sections of the university, especially left-wing members of the university. So Marxists were very influential at the time, in the 1950s. All these sections of the university were keen to show that AMU could play a special role in the nation-building enterprise. So they highlighted, for instance, AMU's legacy as a repository of Ganga Yamuna Tehzeeb. They also put forward the unique composition of AMU's student body. Of course, the majority of students were Muslim, but actually you had a significant section of the population, of the student population, who was also non-Muslim, about 20–30%. There were also students coming from different states. So for Abdul Alim, who was professor of Arabic and a former member of Jamia, this made AMU an ideal laboratory to develop what he called a new form of Indian culture. There was, however, no consensus on the extent of this reorientation, including among those who supported these reforms. For instance, both Nehru and Azad supported dropping the word Muslim from the university's name, a change that Zakir Hussain firmly opposed. These debates epitomized once again the ambiguities of the Congress's secular nationalism. On the one side, Azad and Nehru clearly identified AMU as a Muslim institution. But on the other side, they feared that to explicitly highlight AMU's Muslim character may revive communal tensions and hamper the nation's unity. These ambivalences and the strong anti-Muslim bias of UP Congress fueled apprehensions on campus among certain sections of the university that maybe these reforms would lead to the erasure of AMU's Muslim character. Some even accused Zakir Hussain of carrying out a shubhi of the institution. Now, these tensions captured more largely a growing discontent towards the Congress among North Indian Muslims, as many feared that state authorities were trying to impose a majoritarian conception of Indian culture in the garb of national unity. And these tensions came to a head in the 1960s as the government proved unable to contain the resurgence of politics. Chapter 3 focuses on the campaign for AMU's minority status, which I argue played a pivotal role in the emergence of a form of Muslim politics focused primarily on the defense of religious minority rights. The campaign participated more largely in the pluralization of Indian politics in the 1960s, which were marked by the erosion of Congress's dominance much before the post-emergency crisis, which is often considered to be the main turning point. AMU's campaign constituted one of the first large-scale mobilizations for Muslim minority rights after independence. In the 1950s, you had several major campaigns for the official recognition of Urdu, but these were always framed in terms of linguistic minority rights. Whereas here, the demand of AMU's minority status was clearly projected as a Muslim demand. The affair started as an internal dispute over student quotas, but it soon became a major Muslim issue, as the students' agitation transformed into a massive mobilization for the recognition of AMU's minority status. And here, Muslim organizations played a key role in this transformation. So we have to remember that Muslim organizations were very much part of the politics of the university. The campaign took off just 1 year, so in 1965, which was just 1 year after the formation of the Majlis-e-Mushawarah, which is basically an umbrella organization which brought together heterogeneous groups like the Jamia Millia Islamia, which had been a long-term ally of Congress, but also Jamia Millia Islamia and the Indian Muslim League. And the formation of this unprecedented alliance epitomized the rise of a more assertive form of Muslim politics, which was more openly critical of the government's failure to protect Muslim citizens. The Aligarh campaign provided these actors a platform to bolster their claim to speak for all Muslims, as they made special efforts to build support among Muslims in different parts of the country. So for example, they carried out petition campaigns through newspapers in different cities. They also called for special prayers in favor of the minority status, etc. The campaign also allowed students to emerge once again, much like in 1945 and 46, as significant political actors with the capacity to mobilize support within and beyond their institution in the name of the community. And finally, the campaign became a testing ground for what I call issue-based coalitions. What I mean by issue-based coalitions is basically coalitions that bring together heterogeneous groups, not only students, but also community organizations, political parties, around a common issue. In the absence of a strong Muslim political party in North India, this type of issue-based coalition quickly became the dominant form of Muslim politics in that part of the country. Think, for example, of the All India Muslim Personnel Law Board in the 1970s, or the Babri Masjid Action Committee in the following decades. Now, the campaign reinforced the notion that Indian Muslims formed a distinct entity with shared rights and shared interests. State authorities themselves consolidated this notion, as they repeatedly negotiated with Muslim organizations over the AMU issue in the hope of securing the support of Muslim voters. So this is an issue that came up regularly on the eve of elections. Now, at the same time, the campaign demonstrated the gap between AMU's claim to speak for all Muslims and the deep divisions that persisted on campus. It also showed the limits of the influence of these Muslim coalitions over state authorities. It is only in 1981, so 16 years after the beginning of the campaign, and most importantly, after the historic defeat of Congress in the 1977 elections, that the Congress finally conceded most of the demands of the protesters in the hope, again, to secure Muslim voter support. Now let me move on to my fourth point. Through the campaign for minority status, AMU occupied the center stage in Muslim politics for more than 15 years. But there was no consensus regarding minority politics, neither at AMU nor at Jamia. And so in the following chapters, so chapters 4, 5, 6, quite a long book, I show that in both these institutions, other forms of politics unfolded, which challenged the legitimacy of politics, of the politics primarily focused on the defense of Muslims' minority rights. So at Jamia, for example, university authorities and faculty firmly held on to the composite nationalism of their predecessors. Unlike at AMU, Jamia's faculty did not claim minority status to protect Jamia's Muslim character until well into the 1990s. They feared that this status would tag them as communal and reduce their scope for action. They sought instead to highlight the institution's ongoing commitment to nation building without having to erase its Muslim markers. So for this, they paid special attention to the development of Urdu medium education, which had been one of Jamia's characteristic features from the beginning. In the 1970s, for example, they proposed to transform Jamia into a central Urdu university with affiliated colleges throughout the country. Now, this was quite a daring move, given that Jamia was still a very small institution at the time and was not even yet recognized as a full-fledged university. Teachers insisted on Urdu's trans-communal character, which was of course a way to resist its fast marginalization as a minority language after independence. The defense of Urdu was not just a secular cover for the pursuit of Muslim minority interests, as Paul Brass suggests. This was more a way, I argued, to uphold a vision of the nation in which Islamic symbols could be valued as an integral part of India's shared legacy. Jamia authorities again distanced themselves from minority politics in the 1980s when they led a campaign to obtain full university status. To justify their demand, they repeatedly invoked Jamia's historical character, an expression which allowed them to avoid the minority tag without having to erase Jamia's distinctive trajectory as a nationalist Muslim institution. Congress, however, was unwilling to include explicit reminders of this unique character. The debates in the parliament reflected once again the ambiguities of Congress. By granting Jamia Central University status, of course, Congress was trying to convey a message of goodwill to Muslim citizens, much like with AMU. But at the same time, they remained reluctant to recognize, for example, that Jamia had been established by Muslim individuals, that Urdu education was a central aspect of its educational project, or that it was primarily meant for Muslim students, even though it was not exclusively meant for Muslim students. As the Hindu right was on the rise, remember we are in the late 1980s, they feared that such move may trigger a Hindu backlash. And in this context, neither the Congress nor even Jamia's authorities seemed to have the adequate language to justify a policy that would simultaneously uphold the national and the Muslim character of the institution. The teachers' demand to preserve the historical character of Jamia was itself remarkably vague, and it offered little response to those who increasingly attacked any pro-Muslim measure as a form of minority appeasement. So to step away from this trap that you're in, if you oppose the secular versus the communal, university authorities at Jamia and Aligarh increasingly framed their demands and their policies in terms of Muslim socioeconomic uplift. This became the new, more consensual framework that they used from the 1970s and 80s onwards, which is the object of Chapter 5. Several scholars after the 1990s, as well as Asmanda activists, have argued that the demolition of the Babri Masjid in 1992 introduced a sharp break in Muslim politics. So according to them, the demolition exposed traditional Muslim leaders whom they held as partly responsible for the rise of communal tensions. It also highlighted the need for what they call an alternative strategy, which was more focused on economic development and social justice instead of identity politics. But in practice, it's difficult to completely oppose development and identity politics, or to even argue that elite Muslim leaders continuously ignored socioeconomic issues before the 1990s. In reality, the question of Muslims' backwardness had been a recurrent theme in Muslim politics since the colonial period, and it received renewed attention in the 1970s and 80s. Here, several factors came into play. First, an increasing feeling of being neglected by the state, which was combined with the increased consciousness that large sections of the Muslim population were lagging behind in terms of development. Remember that in the early 1980s, you have the first report, the Gopal Singh report, that documents extensively the gap in socioeconomic development among religious minorities. This was also a time marked by the rise of upwardly mobile Muslim groups who aspired to improve their status, as well as a time where you had a growing influence of caste-based politics in the country. Now, Muslim educational institutions, including, of course, Aligarh and Jamia, played a leading role in the renewal of these discussions on Muslims' backwardness. During this period, a number of religious associations, political leaders, but also professionals and businessmen mobilized to set up new schools, Muslim schools. Likewise, So this was especially true in southern India. Likewise, AMU and Jamia authorities insisted on the need to expand opportunities for disadvantaged Muslims. Now, this development-oriented policy could serve to shift attention away from community-centric claims, as was the case at Jamia under the Vice-Chancellor Anwar Jamal Kidwai. In the 1980s, Jamia's neighborhood was attracting increasing numbers of migrants looking for better job opportunities in Delhi's area. In this context, Kidwai insisted on the need to develop job-oriented courses that could have, I quote, a large impact on Muslim unemployment in Delhi and its surrounding areas. According to him, what characterized Jamia students was their backwardness more than their Muslimness per se. I quote him again, "The student population of Jamia is mixed in respect of religion, region, and sex. However, there is one major common factor, that is the lack of resources and their general backwardness." Kidwai did not deny that most of Jamia students were Muslim, but he clearly prioritized socioeconomic development over community-centric claims. Much like Nehru before him, he feared that to highlight Jamia's denominational character may fuel inward-looking tendencies and threaten its efforts to provide better job opportunities for students. In practice, however, these development policies often remain closely intertwined with the defense of community-based interests, and this was particularly true at AMU, where university authorities continue to project the university as an all-India Muslim institution meant to serve the entire colony. The AMU Act, which was adopted by Parliament in 1981, strengthened this claim. It officially recognized that AMU's mission was to promote the educational advancement of all Indian Muslims. Now, that's quite a task for a single institution. So in this way, both university and state authorities endorsed the idea that Muslim citizens formed a separate category of citizens, whose access to state support was to be mediated by Muslim institutions. Within this framework, development politics therefore became an alternative form of Muslim politics, rather than an alternative to Muslim politics. Now, while promoting Muslim socioeconomic uplift provided university authorities with a consensual framework for their policies, a growing number of students in this period adopted a much less consensual objective. That was to promote the superiority of what they called pure Islam and to defend the Ummah against Islam's enemies. That's the object of chapter 6. Part of the student body found in this discourse, initially championed by Islamist groups, a sense of empowerment that minority politics failed to convey. At AMU, students affiliated with the Jamaat Islami envisioned themselves as the vanguards of an Islamic movement which was meant to rejuvenate the community. They pushed for a reform of the university so that it may align with their own conception of Islamic values and become the center of this Islamic movement. So they really envisioned Aligarh as the potential center of an Islamic movement that they were calling for. Unsurprisingly, their call to purify Islam and the university had deeply divisive effects on campus, because of course it marginalized non-Muslim students and it also antagonized all the Muslim students and teachers who did not share this conception of Muslim culture and Islam. However, these groups gained increasing traction in the 1980s as they positioned themselves as the champions of an Islamic danger. Their influence peaked in the early 1990s as the Ram Rath Yatra to Ayodhya gave an immediate resonance to their call to defend Islam. And even at Jamia, this rhetoric gained increasing appeal. In 1992, as tensions over the Babri Masjid were building up, a major controversy erupted around Salman Rushdie's contentious novel, The Satanic Verses. There too, large sections of students mobilized on an unprecedented scale, calling for the defense of Islam against its internal and external enemies. In the process, they projected Jamia, which was often seen as a Gandhian institution, as a Muslim symbol and a bastion of an embattled community. The demolition of the Babri Masjid in December 1992 dealt a major blow to this politics of self-assertion and shrill contestation. It was a brutal exposure of the balance of power that the Hindu right intended to put in place. In this context, few students chose to follow a path of further radicalization. Despite a widespread sense of frustration, many preferred instead to turn within towards a more apolitical interpretation of Islam. Others, still, sought an alternative to communal politics by putting renewed emphasis on, again, socioeconomic uplift. In so doing, they highlighted once again the leading role that Muslim universities had to play in this reorientation. First, as instruments of Muslims' educational uplift. Second, as platforms from where a new leadership and new forms of Muslim politics could emerge. We mentioned FDR during our conversation, so this was clearly part of that attempt to, bring forward a new form of politics which was more focused on social justice issues. Now, so far, I have not spoken much about women. This is partly because women initially occupied a marginal position both at Jamia and AMU. Like most educational institutions established during the colonial period, Jamia and Aligarh were initially established by men for men. There was no Muslim exception. In chapter 7, I trace women's trajectory from the margins to a more central position in both these institutions. I also examine whether and how AMU and Jamia's Muslim character affected discussions on women's status in these institutions. So I argue that, like in many other institutions, women's education remained for a long time essentially a class project, focused on the formation of companionate wives. After independence, it was recast as a nationalist project, training beautiful female citizens serving society. Preserving Muslim identity was not the prime objective of women's education in these institutions. However, in the 1970s and 80s, the rise of Islamist groups and the larger debates about Muslim personal law put increasing pressure on women students and teachers to define themselves as Muslim women. With the rise of communal tensions, many women further internalized the idea that adopting a critical stance either towards their institutions or towards Muslim personal law could be seen as a form of betrayal, exposing their community to further attacks. As Muslim women, students and teachers were expected to prioritize the defense of their institutions and beyond of their institutions beyond and beyond of their community. Women learned to negotiate their location on campus within this framework. For example, for teachers, it was by promoting women's access to higher education rather than by challenging gender disparities in the educational system or even patriarchal notions of Muslim culture that they hoped to open new opportunities for female students. But this may be changing now. In the recent years, both Aligarh and Jamia have been witness to protests and campaigns led by female students which directly target gender-based inequalities. I have in mind, for example, the mobilization of women college students at AMU to access the Central Library, or Jamia's campaign called Pads Against Sexism in 2015. This reflects a larger trend on Indian campuses. 2012 anti-rape movement marked in that sense a turning point in women's mobilization, particularly in universities. And so it has led to more mobilizations led by women, including female students. In this context, in 2015, students from Jamia Millia initiated a campaign that probably many of you have heard of, Pinjra Tour, so break the cage, to protest against restrictions imposed upon women students on campus. This campaign quickly spread to other universities. So here, against the assumption that Muslim women are more shy or subdued, this campaign showed clearly that female students in these universities could play a leading role in these mobilizations. This also helps maybe explain why female students at Jamia and AMU occupied such a prominent position in the recent anti-CAA protests. Many of these participants had actually taken an active part in campus-based protests earlier, often fighting for women-related issues. Moreover, this time there was no question of betraying one's institution or community, quite on the opposite. With anti-CAA protests, women fought for the survival of a secular nation-state in which Indian Muslims, both men and women, are recognized as equal citizens. Now, just a few words of conclusion of a very long presentation. The book has argued that AMU and Jamia have played a central role in the debates on Muslims' location in the Indian nation. As objects and arenas of debates, they have channeled competing conceptions of what it means to be an Indian Muslim. Aligarh and Jamia both remain today important Muslim symbols for their supporters as well as for their detractors. For many students, and arguably for a number of Indian Muslims outside of these universities, these institutions are associated with the glorious past and the promise of a better future. For others, however, they constitute hotbeds of separatism that epitomize Muslims' allegedly communal tendencies. This was reflected, of course, during the anti-CA protests, when students were accused of being jihadis or anti-national. These protests also showed that university campuses continue to play a crucial role as platforms for democratic debates beyond elected bodies and political parties. This democratic function has become all the more important in a context where opposition parties are sometimes reluctant to challenge head-on the narrative of the dominant party, especially on the Muslim question. In the recent years, key opposition parties, starting with the Congress, have grown increasingly wary of being tagged as pro-Muslim. In this context, students' vocal protests against the CAA sharply contrast with the restraint of opposition parties. Through these mobilizations, Aligarh and Jamia do not only serve as Muslim symbols, they also continue to provide, much like in the early years of independence, platforms to develop non-majoritarian conceptions of the nation, where Muslims can be recognized as full-fledged citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurence. That was a really good presentation, and I'm sure that people will be reading this book very carefully. Before I open up for questions, I want to make 6 quick points. 2 by way of what I can only call minor illusions, what may be missed. My first point is that in trying to understand AMU and Jamia and their required histories, a certain focus on their physical settings perhaps very important. Aligarh as the university town, definitionally speaking, small town, big university. Oxford, Cambridge, Bonn, you have many examples of this. I think that really plays a very important role in AMU's configuration and in the kind of campus it becomes. Because you do mention this, that the local interest does predominate, and of course there's a certain kind of provincialization of Aligarh. My student Chetna is here, in thesis is just she's going to defend a thesis very soon. She's used this term hinterland cosmopolitanism in reference to Allahabad University, and you can see the hinterland prevailing over the cosmopolitan universal element of university. And it's, I think, a very sad story of Indian universities. There's a kind of a provinciality that tends to predominate over the cosmopolitan universality that a university should really stand for. So that's one aspect of the physical setting. Jamia, we're not very far away from Jamia, and I always love coming back to this neighborhood. It is a neighborhood university, and it has a certain kind of relationship with the ghetto of Jamia Nagar. In some ways comparable to Columbia and the abutting Harlem that abuts it. And I think that a mention of that is very important in terms of understanding AMU and Jamia and their conjoined histories. Now, at the end of the remarks that I made, the point that you, of course, made in your book, which I just kind of hinted at, the way that Jamia has really kind of moved ahead, and AMU has been left behind. It's like, 2 cars. One kind of left behind and Jamia kind of following. There certainly is a locational advantage that explains it. The fact that it is in Delhi and it's South Delhi, that faculty members prefer to be appointed here rather than the AMU, which has become something of a provincial background. Very, very sad to say that. So that aspect of the physical setting I thought was slightly missing and perhaps could have been talked about a little more. Also architecturally, I mean, we have that's perhaps the only significant heritage building. In the 1930s, Hines was the architect. But AMU is grand, I mean, for the Cambridge person, right? Trinity College, Cambridge is SS South. And I think that this plays a very important role in the self-definition of these universities. Let me just kind of tell you, it's a rather cheesy joke that we used to play at the expense of Jamia when we were students. So when we were students and we would talk about Jamia and we would just say, well, what is Jamia really? You get all the bathrooms and the loos of AMU. That's one Jamia for you. And that is how disparagingly people talk about Jamia back in those days. I don't think they should do it anymore. But this is just a kind of an example of the disparaging way. Certainly not the way that Oxford and Cambridge talk about it. The other place, right?
No, it's the other place.
The other place.
Precisely.
Okay, let me come to the second point that I thought again was perhaps a missing element, which is to do with universities as significant middle-class formers. I mean, these are places that give incoming students a certain kind of social capital of middle-class and certain elite formation. And it so happens that Indian universities are not doing this anymore. JMU, that I'm perhaps the most familiar with, if there's any university I'm familiar with, is JMU. Now, the one thing I read about JMU is that it was this university that brought people in from all parts of the country, all kinds of social backgrounds, and gave them a certain kind of a push-up, catapulting to elite status. Now, the one thing that I noticed about, all elites are despicable, but the Indian elite is more despicable than most other elites in the world. Now, the reason why I'm saying this is because what the Indian elites have done with the public university is that they've used them, they've promoted and catapulted themselves to elite positions, and then kicked the ladder away. This is the South Korean economist, his term. So this instrumental manner of using the public university to catapult yourself to where you want to be, and then very sadistically kicking the ladder away and saying, you better be in your place, people from lower down the strata. And there's a very significant caste element here. Stay where you are. And I think this, to my mind, is the tragedy of the Indian university. I think Indian universities, if you want to tell a fairy tale, they're all about once upon a time they were great universities. And then they all died out, one after the other. It's very sad to see this happening, and we need to have to think about this. Of course, your book is not it's not institutional history, but it does tell the story of the political history of India, and I think this is a significant part of that story. On the point about the middle class, and this point that you make about Islamism on campus, as I was reading your book, I was reminded of a 1982 article that I read in the journal Daedalus by, I'm getting old now, I'm forgetting names now. But that's not the point. The point is that this article talked about the rise of Islamism in Egypt. And the point that was made was that you had a certain kind of a petty bourgeois strata flowing in from not the big town, not Cairo, but the smaller towns, Tanta for example, provincial towns. So Aligarh is full of that, right? Jamia is full of that. Now, the reason why people from the petty bourgeois, low middle class came to these places was that they wanted the kind of middle class security that university education could provide. Now, sadly, from the 1970s onwards, university education did not translate into employability, which again was the story of Aligarh Jamia, which you mentioned very earlier. Now, this translated, this secular discontent of the lack of upward mobility then translated itself into a certain kind of political Islamism. And to my mind, although this is not a very oft-quoted article, I think this is a good explanation for the rise of Islamism on campuses in places like Egypt. It also mentioned Turkey, but I think it could be extended to India in terms of understanding how this Islamic movement of India became such a significant force on the AMU campus, on the Jamia campus. So that was the other aspect. Let me come to the Islamic versus controversy, because that's my obsession, right? The damn thing never goes away. Just yesterday, Salman Rushdie has made this absolutely outrageous statement about Palestine state. It'll become like a Taliban. And he's going soft on the US campus protests, saying, a man who has become the embodiment of free speech for 35 years is now becoming mealy-mouthed about free speech right now on US university campus. And that shows you the sheer crass opportunism of the whole free speech discourse, because as far as I can see it, this is the biggest attack on free speech that we're witnessing right now. I mentioned Colombia, I'll come back to Colombia in a while, because that's kind of fronting the protest. This is the point I'll just quickly come back to, but quickly on Nehru in India. It's very difficult to make this point, right? Whenever we talk about Nehru in India, there's always the danger of romanticizing it. Of course, you don't do that. But what I was struck by was how harsh, how cruel, how intolerant Nehru's India could be to the AMU, and I specifically refer to the MC Chagla. Of course, Nehru had died by that time, so the Nehruvian consensus was still around. Now, as you rightly said, Chagla in the 1965 controversy when Ali Yavarjani, the vice chancellor, was assaulted on campus, overdid it, that's what he used, and that's a brilliant word to use. Now, what one realizes is that perhaps the supposed liberal, tolerant Nehruvian consensus could be as harsh to a Muslim university as the current BJP regime is to Jamia and AMU. It's surprising. Now that tells you the ambivalences of the Nehruvian legacy, which we should be talking about. Not in terms of romanticizing it, but learning from the mistakes of the past. Because we must, if this country is to survive, we are perhaps going through the most consequential election of our times, right? Secularism must be reclaimed. It cannot be reclaimed by going back to an Nehruvian past, but moving forward to a more meaningful secularism. And I hope and pray, I have started praying a little more these days. I hope and pray that AMU, Jamia, JNU can play that pivotal role in terms of creating the secularism that will sustain and keep this country together, because we are seeing a certain kind of polarization that, frankly speaking, is scary. So the Nehruvian consensus, I think what your chapter prompted me to do already on Muslim universities, not to the extent that these guys are, but certainly it was pretty intolerant in the way that MC Chagla played out the whole role. He should have done that. And by the way, MC Chagla, those of you who don't know, because we're talking to younger people here, Mohammad Karim Chagla, Chief Justice of the Bombay High Court, remarkably erudite, Oxford-educated lawyer. But you know, the instrumental manner in which he played the bogey of the Muslim communal element, the backward Muslim communal, which I'm not saying is not there, of course it's there, but you can't play the bogeyman here. And I think that it did not really reflect well in terms of his progressive credentials. Finally. Well, no, not finally, there's another one after this. The women's question. Okay, that was the chapter that I read the most. I mean, I didn't get enough time to read it as much as I could, but I must mention this one because it goes back to a conversation that I had in 2005 when I was still a faculty member in Jamia. It goes like, a Frenchman is involved in this, a French person, not you of course. So riots had happened in Paris that year, okay, 2005, those riots. And it was clear there was an underclass of North African immigrants who were protesting against the depravities of the French police. Now the Frenchman that I was talking to, someone very much on the left, said, but where are the women? Sorry, my bad French. And I said, listen, you give this another generation. There will be, I assure you, there'll be women there. Now, I look back, how many years, 19 years, and I look at the CAA protests, and I looked at when I look back or remember the times of 2005, I would look at the women in my class, silent, not speaking up. Look at the way in which those women have spoken up. Look at what education can do in the span of one generation. I go back to that conversation with the French friend, my friend. And I said, just give it a generation. And that is what public education can do. That is the promise of public universities and universities like Jamia and Aligarh. Now the last question, which way Jamia and AMU? Okay, this is a fraught time to live through. Free speech it's under attack. Not just here, especially in America right now. Columbia, fronting it. It's good to see that. And whenever I think of Columbia as the place where the whole post-colonialism rubbish began. And I am no friend of post-colonialism. But what it does tell me is that what redeems the university is actually the student. Not the tenured faculty member, because the meme going around is, can the tenured speak? Of course they can't. They can't speak, of course they can't speak. But the students who transiently pass through the portals of a university are the ones who will redeem the university, and it is on that optimistic note that I can think that there is a future for AMU and Jamia. There's also another book for you to write very soon. I'll stop there, and let's take questions. There's a lot to talk about.
No, I mean like Farooqi.
पहले आप कर रहे हैं ना लखनऊ
I think I think you have already kind of captured the sentiment, as it were.
Sense of the house.
In some ways, but just to kind of outline a few comments, concerns. So there is no denying that here is a work that kind of draws our attention to what could be considered as entangled histories, intimate enemy, and so on. But I was thinking about the idea of community itself, and I go back to what Amir Bhai was pointing out a while ago. So the university as a community in itself, and then the university in a certain quest vis-a-vis a community. Of course, the book does not really get into the idea of the university as such, but just to kind of look into some possible significance of this particular concern. So, and in that regard, I want to look into why this investment, the Nehruvian investment, Nehru's in fact, investment in AMU and not so much in Jamia. So you've already pointed out 1948, but interestingly, Nehru was after Zakir Husain's life to be Aligarh's Vice Chancellor. And Zakir Hussain was dead against that. He said that, what are you doing to me? And Zakir Hussain left AMU on a very clear note. And Nehru, in some senses, was very clear that if there is one Muslim in the subcontinent who can really make sure that AMU rose across, it's Zakir Hussain. And he was there. So Nehru, in the first convocation after the independence, and then Maulana Azad, and Sarojini Naidu, and this is no ordinary lot, right, to grace the occasion one after another. Interestingly, there is so the university as a community, because in Aligarh, in the university itself, I'm sure it's there in the book, that there was a very powerful sentiment that was pro-League, and there was a local sentiment that was anti-AMU. So the locals were very much in favor of shutting down the university. And here, to Nehru's credit, although whatever you said is absolutely right, but I think it was Nehru primarily who made sure that AMU was there and it remained as an institution of eminence and of significance. And interestingly, when Maulana Azad went, I think it was 1949 February, so when the event the convocation started, in the recitation, when the Quranic verses were recited, the person recited a verse or verses that actually spoke about hypocrisy, as if Maulana Azad did not get it. But he of course, being a generous leader, he avoided that, but he could get it, that this student is actually talking about me through Quran, that the hypocrites are back, and so on. So I just wanted to look into this idea of community. Also, of course I haven't read the book from cover to cover, but just to kind of go through the first 2 chapters, it's also something that saddens us, because we think about what charged up spaces these were at one point of time, and how horrendously depoliticized these campuses have become. Depoliticized in this, I'm talking about Jamia as of now.
Yeah, because a few years ago it was not so
sorry. Yeah, no, of course. This is not to kind of tone down the importance of the anti-CAA protests, but if you look at the kind of silence that is there in Jamia right now, and also the politics of all kinds of inappropriate, the politics that caters to all kinds of inappropriate means in AMU. So it's something that I also was thinking about. Just one more thing, interestingly, Gandhi wrote to Iqbal to be the Vice Chancellor of Jamia. So Gandhi did not have Muhammad Ali in mind. And it's quite remarkable, and this is where I think history gets such a complicated domain, because Iqbal was not, at least when Gandhi wrote to Iqbal was not in favor of the Khilafat movement. Iqbal was quite clear that this movement is not really for Khilafat, this is just a bunch of Muslim leaders who are in it for their own. And Muhammad Ali Jawhar wrote against Iqbal, soon after. So Gandhi is writing to Iqbal, and Iqbal, of course, being a very smart person, he sort of apologized and he said that I'm not really the right person to lead the university, and so on. And lastly, the fate of Urdu, because when we talk about Jamia, Urdu is so central and so pivotal. But if you think about Urdu as a medium of instruction, and this is where I think the secular comes in. So after Mushir Sahab took over, one of the things that became very important in Jamia was that, what do we do about this Urdu medium? And I remember a sociology professor who sort of saw to it that Urdu was there in sociology department at least, because in other departments, it just disappeared within 5-6 years. Of course, the situation was not very, very good before Mushir Sahab took over. But I think one has to also think about the secular's association with a certain linguistic aspect of a community's identity, if at all one were to kind of phrase it that way. So these are some of the comments that I just thought of.
Thank you.
Just comments,
This was during the pandemic, and it was, we still had the anti-Semitic protests, which were still very much vivid in our minds. I believe that it's possible that there is a declining in politicization, but what we must remember is that these trajectories are never linear. It's not as if we're moving from vibrant politicization to complete depoliticization, or vice versa. In fact, it keeps on going up. And maybe, just to go back to one of your comments about Islamism in Egypt, maybe this current politicization is a form of response to the current political context, where maybe many students feel that maybe it's better to keep,
quiet right now.
To keep quiet right now. This doesn't mean that the same students will not, again, mobilize in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. With these remarks, I declare this event successfully concluded. We had a wonderful, presentation, really exciting questions, some material to think about, and with that, the tea is served outside. Thank you very much for being here.